5. This is a weapon shorter than a sword and longer than a dagger. Trans. Sometimes they are known, says Duperrey, to receive under their protection vanquished enemies and become their defenders, but the motive prompting them to this seemingly generous conduct is always one of special vindictiveness, the fact being that their real object is the total extermination of some tribe allied with the opposite party. Among themselves, hatred is the ruling passion. It is the only enduring bond of fidelity. All display undoubted courage, spirit, recklessness, implacability towards their enemies, whom they massacre with a shocking insensibility. Haughty in manner and revengeful in disposition, they treat all strangers with unqualified suspicion, but they are hospitable and generous to all whom they take as friends. All their passions are easily excited, but they are inordinately sensitive with regard to their liberty and their rights, which they are ever ready to defend sword in hand. Never forgetting an injury, they know not how to forgive. Nothing less than the lifeblood of their enemies can quench their thirst for vengeance. Duperrey pledges himself to the truth of the picture which he has here drawn of these savage children of the Andes, who at least deserve the credit of having from the 16th century to the present day managed to preserve their independence against the attacks of all invaders. After the departure of General Frere and the troops he led away with him, Duperrey took advantage of the opportunity to get his vessel provisioned as quickly as possible. The water and the biscuits were soon on board, but longer time was necessary to procure supplies of coal, which, however, was to be got without any other expense save that of paying the muleteers, who transported it to the beach from a mine scarcely beneath the level of the earth, where it was to be picked up for nothing. Although the events happening at Conception during the detention there of the Coquille were far from being cheerful, the prevailing depression could not hold out against the traditional festivities of the carnival. Dinners, receptions, and balls recommenced, and the departure of the troops made itself felt only in the paucity of cavaliers. The French officers, in acknowledgment of the hospitable welcome offered to them, gave 2 balls at Talcahuano, and several families came from Conception for the sole purpose of being present at them. Unfortunately, Duperrey's narrative breaks off at the date of his quitting Chile, and there is no longer any official record from which to gather the details of a voyage so interesting and successful. Far from being able to trace step by step from original documents the course of the expedition, as has been done in the case of other travellers, we are obliged in our turn to epitomize other epitomes now lying before us. It is an unpleasing task, as little agreeable to the reader as it is difficult for the writer, who, while bound to respect facts, is no longer able to enliven his narrative with personal observations and the generally lively stories of the travellers themselves. However, some few of the letters of the navigator to the Minister of Marine have been published, from which have been extracted the following details. On the 15th February, 1823, the Coquille set sail from Conception for Paita, the place where in 1595 Alvarez de Mendana and Fernandez de Quiros took ship on the voyage of discovery that has made their names famous. But after a fortnight's sail, the corvette was becalmed in the vicinity of the island of Lorenzo, and Duperrey resolved to put in at Callao to obtain fresh provisions. It need not be said that Callao is the port of Lima, so the officers could not lose the opportunity of paying a visit to the capital of Peru. They were not fortunate in the time of their visit. The ladies were away for sea bathing at Miraflores, and the men of most distinction in the place had gone with them. The travellers were thus compelled to rest content with an inspection of the chief residences and public buildings of the city, returning to Callao on the 4th March. On the 9th of the same month the Coquille anchored at Paita. The situation of this place between the terrestrial and magnetic equators was most favourable for conducting observations on the variations of the magnetic needle. The naturalists also made excursions to the desert of Pira, where they collected specimens of petrified shells embedded in a tertiary stratum precisely similar to that in the suburbs of Paris. As soon as all the sources of scientific interest at Paita had been exhausted, the Coquille resumed her voyage, setting sail for Otaheite. During the sail thither a circumstance occurred which might have materially delayed the progress of the expedition, if not have led to its total destruction. On the night of the 22nd April, the Coquille being in the waters of the dangerous archipelago, the officer of the watch all at once heard the sound of breakers dashing over reefs. He immediately made the ship lie to, and at daybreak the peril which had been escaped became manifest. At the distance of barely 1.5 miles from the corvette lay a low island, well wooded, and fringed with rocks along its entire extent. A few people lived on it, some of whom approached the vessel in a canoe, but none of them would venture on board. Duperrey had to give up all thoughts of visiting the island, which received the name of Clermont-Tonnerre. On all sides the waves broke violently on the rocks, and he could do no more than coast it from end to end at a little distance. The next and following days some small islands of no note were discovered, to which were given the names of Augia, Freycinet and Lostanges. At length, as the sun rose on the 3rd May, the verdant shores and woody mountains of Otaheite came in sight. Duperrey, like preceding visitors, could not help noticing the thorough change which had been effected in the manners and practices of the natives. Not a canoe came alongside the Coquille. It was the hour of divine worship when the corvette entered the Bay of Matavai, and the missionaries had collected the whole population of the island, to the number of 7,000, inside the principal church of Papahoa, to discuss the articles of a new code of laws. The Otaheitan orators, it seems, would not yield the palm to those of Europe. There were not a few of them gifted with the valuable talent of being able to talk for several hours without saying anything, and to make an end of the most promising undertakings with the flowers of their rhetoric. A description of one of these meetings is given by 500 Irville. M. Lejeune, the draftsman of the expedition, went by himself to be present at the meeting held the next day, when certain political questions were submitted to the popular assembly. It lasted for several hours, during which the chiefs took it in turn to speak. The most brilliant speaker of the gathering was a chief called Tati. The chief point of discussion was the imposition of an annual poll tax at the rate of 5 measures of oil per man. Then came a question as to the taxes which were to be levied, whether they should be on behalf of the king or on behalf of the missionaries. After some time, we arrived at the conclusion that the first question had been answered in the affirmative, but that the second, the one relating to the missionaries, had been postponed by themselves from a forecast of its probable failure. About 4,000 persons were present at this kind of national congress. 2 months before, Otaheite had renounced the English flag, in order to adopt one of its own, but that Pacific revolution in no wise diminished the confidence which the people placed in their missionaries. The latter received the French travellers in a friendly manner, and supplied them at the usual prices with the stores of which they stood in need. But what seemed especially curious in the reforms effected by the missionaries was the total change in the behaviour of the women. From being, according to the statements of Cook, Bougainville and contemporary explorers, compliant to an unheard-of degree, they had become most modest, reserved and decently conducted, so that the whole island wore the air of a convent, a revolution as amusing as it was unnatural. From Otaheite the Coquille proceeded to the adjacent island of Bora Bora, belonging to the same group, where European customs had been adopted to the same extent, and on the 9th June, steering a westerly course, made a survey in turn of the islands Salvage, Koa, Santa Cruz, Bougainville and Bauka, finally coming to an anchor in the harbour of Praslin on the coast of New Ireland, famous for its beautiful waterfall. The friendly relations which were established with the natives there were the means of extending our knowledge of the human race, by the observation of some peculiarities which had not fallen under the notice of preceding travellers. The sentence just quoted from an abridged account appearing in the Annals of Voyages, which merely excites curiosity without satisfying it, causes us here to express our regret that the original narrative of the voyage has not been published in its entirety. The Waterfall of Port Praslin. The Waterfall of Port Praslin. Facsimile of early engraving. The student Paul de Blasville, the same who afterwards lost his life with the Lillois in the polar regions, undertook a journey to the village of Praslin, in spite of all the means adopted by the savages to deter him. When there he was shown a kind of temple, where several ill-shaped, grotesque idols had been set up on a platform surrounded by walls. Great pains were taken to prepare a chart of St. George's Channel, after which Duperrey paid a visit to the islands previously surveyed by Schouten to the northeast of New Guinea. 3 days, the 26th, 27th, and were devoted to a survey of them. The explorer after this searched ineffectually for the islands Stephen and de Carteret, and after comparing his own route with that taken by 500 Entrecasteaux in 1792, he came to the conclusion that this group must be identical with that of Providence, discovered long since by Dampier. On the 3rd of September the North Cape of New Guinea was recognized. 3 days later the Coquille entered the narrow and rocky harbour of Offac on the northwest coast of Waigiou, one of the Papuan Islands. The only navigator who has mentioned this harbour is Forrest. Duperrey therefore felt unusual satisfaction at having explored a corner of the earth, all but untrodden by the foot of the European. It was also an interesting fact for geographers that the existence of a southern bay, separated from Offac by a very narrow isthmus, was established. 2 officers, D'Urville and de Blasville, were employed in this work, which Berard Latin and de Blois de la Calande connected with that accomplished by Duperrey on the coast during the cruise of the Uranie. This land was found to be particularly rich in vegetable products, and 500 Urville was able there to form the nucleus of a collection as valuable for the novelty as the beauty of its specimens. 500 Urville and Lesson, full of curiosity to study the inhabitants who belonged to the Papuan race, started for the shore immediately after the corvette arrived at the island in a boat manned with 7 sailors. They had already walked some distance in a deluge of rain, when all at once they found themselves opposite a cottage built upon piles, and covered over with leaves of the plane tree. Cowering amongst the bushes at a little distance was a young female savage who seemed to be watching them. A few paces nearer was a heap of about a dozen coconuts freshly gathered, placed well in sight, apparently intended for the refreshment of the visitors. The Frenchmen came to understand that this was a present offered by the youthful savage of whom they had caught a glimpse, and proceeded to feast on the fruits so opportunely placed at their disposal. The native girl, soon gathering confidence from the quiet behavior of the strangers, came forward, crying, "Bongus, good," making signs to show that the coconuts had been presented by herself. Her delicate attention was rewarded by the gift of a necklace and earrings. When 500 Urville regained the boat, he found a dozen Papuans playing, eating, and seeming on the best possible terms with the boatmen. In a short time, he says, they had surrounded me, repeating, "Captain Bongus," and offering various tokens of goodwill. These people are in general of diminutive stature, their constitution is slight and feeble. Leprosy is a common disease among them. Their voice is soft, their behavior grave, polite, and even marked with a certain air of melancholy that is habitually characteristic of them. Natives of New Guinea. Natives of New Guinea. Facsimile of early engraving. Among the antique statues of which the Louvre is full, there is one of Polyhymnia, which is celebrated above the rest for an expression of melancholy pensiveness not usually found among the ancients. It is a singular circumstance that 500 Urville should have observed among the Papuans the very expression of countenance distinguishing this antique statue. On board the corvette, another company of natives were conducting themselves with a calmness and reserve, offering a marked contrast to the usual manner of the greater part of the inhabitants of the lands of Oceania. The same impression was made on the French travellers during a visit paid to the Rajah of the island, as also during his return visit on board the Coquille. In one of the villages on this southern bay was observed a kind of temple, in which were to be seen several rudely carved statues, painted over with various colours, and ornamented with feathers and matting. It was quite impossible to obtain the slightest information on the subject of the worship which the natives paid to these idols. The Coquille set sail again on the 16th September, coasting along the north side of the islands lying between Ine and Yang, and after a brief stay at Kaili reached Ambuna, where the remarkably kind reception given by M. Mercus, the governor of the Molucca Island, afforded the staff an interval of rest from the continual labours of this troublesome voyage. The 27th October saw the corvette again on its course, steering towards Timor and westward of the Turtle and Lucipara Islands. Duperrey next determined the position of the island of Vulcan, sighted the islands of Weta, Baba, Dog, Caming, and finally, entering the channel of Ambe, surveyed a large number of points in the chain of islands stretching from Penty and Ambe in the direction of Java. After having made a chart of Java, and an ineffectual search for the trial islands in the place usually assigned to them, Duperrey steered for New Holland, but through contrary winds was not able to sail along the western coast of the island. On the 10th January he at length rounded Van Diemen's Island, and 6 days after that sighted the lights of Port Jackson, coming to an anchor off Sydney the following day. The governor, Sir Thomas Brisbane, who had received previous intimation of the arrival of the expedition, gave the officers a cordial welcome, forwarded with all the means at his command the revictualling of the corvette, and rendered friendly assistance in the repairs which the somewhat shattered condition of the ship rendered necessary. He also provided means to enable D'Urville and Lesson to make an excursion, full of interest, beyond the Blue Mountains into the plain of Bathurst, the resources of which were as yet but imperfectly known to Europeans. Duperrey did not leave Australia until the 20th of March. On this occasion he directed his course towards New Zealand, which had been rather overlooked in former voyages. The vessel came to an anchor in the Bay of Manawa, forming the southern part of the Grand Bay of Islands. Here the officers occupied their leisure in scientific and geographical observations, and in making researches in natural history. At the same time, the frequent intercourse of the explorers with the natives threw quite a new light upon their manners, their religious notions, their language, and on their attitude of hostility up to that time to the teaching of the missionaries. What these savages most appreciated in European civilization was well-finished weapons, of which at that time they possessed a great quantity, for by their help they were the better able to indulge their sanguinary instincts. The stay of the Cockwill at New Zealand terminated on the 17th of April, when a detour was made northwards as far as Rotuma, discovered but not visited, by Captain Wilson in 1797. The inhabitants, gentle and hospitable, took great pains to furnish the navigators with the provisions they required, but it was not long before the Frenchmen discovered that these gentle islanders, taking advantage of the confidence which they had known how to create, had carried off a number of articles that it afterwards cost much trouble to make them restore. Stringent orders were given, and all thieves caught in the act were flogged in the presence of their fellow countrymen, who, however, as well as the culprits themselves, treated the affair only as a joke. Among these savages 4 Europeans were observed, who had a long time before deserted from the whaleship Rochester. They were no better clothed than the natives, and were tattooed and smeared with a yellow powder after the native fashion, so that it would have been hard to recognize them, but for their white skins and more intelligent looks. They were quite content with their lot, having married wives and reared families at Rotuma, where, escaping the cares, the troubles, and the difficulties of civilized life, they reckoned on ending their days in comfort. One among them asked to be allowed to remain on board the Cockwill, a favour which Duperrey was ready to grant, but the chief of the island was unwilling, until he learned that 2 convicts from Port Jackson asked permission to stay on shore. Although these people, hitherto little known, offered a most interesting subject of study to the naturalists, it was necessary to depart, so the Cockwill proceeded to survey the Coral Isles and St. Augustine, discovered by Morel in 1781. Then came Drummond Island, where the inhabitants, dark-complexioned with slight limbs and unintelligent faces, offered to exchange some triangular shells, commonly called holy water cups, for knives and fishhooks. Next the islands of Sydenham and Henderville, where the inhabitants go entirely naked. After them, Walder, Hupper, Hall, Knox, Charlotte, Matthews, which form the Gilbert archipelago, and finally the Marshall and Mulgrave groups. On the 3rd of June, Duperrey came in sight of the island of Yulan, which had been discovered in 1804 by an American, Captain Crozer. As it was not marked upon any chart, the commander decided upon making an exact and particular survey of it. No sooner had the anchor touched the bottom than Duperrey, accompanied by some of his officers, made for the shore. The inhabitants turned out to be a mild and obliging race, who made their visitors presents of cocoa-nuts and the fruit of the bread tree, conducting them through most picturesque scenery to the dwelling of their principal chief, or Eurostan, as he was called. Dumont d'Urville has given the following sketch of the country through which the travellers passed on their way to the residence of the chief. We glided calmly across a magnificent basin girdled in by a well-wooded shore, the foliage a bright green. Behind us rose the lofty hilltops, carpeted with verdure, from which shot up the light and graceful stems of the cocoa palms. Out of the sea to the front rose the little island of Lele, covered with the pretty cottages of the islanders, and crowned with a verdant mound. If this pleasant prospect be further brightened by a magnificent day, in a delicious climate, some notion may be formed of the sensations we experienced as we proceeded in a sort of triumphal procession, surrounded by a crowd of simple, gentle, kind attendants. The number of persons accompanying the boat's 500 Urville estimated at about 800. On arriving before a neat and charming village with well-paved streets, they divided themselves, the men standing on one side, the women on the other, maintaining an impressive silence. 2 chiefs advanced, and taking the travellers by the hand, conducted them to the dwelling of the Eurostan. The crowd, still silent, remained outside while the Frenchmen entered the chief's house. The Eurostan shortly made his appearance, a pale and shriveled old man, bowed down under the weight of 80 years. The Frenchmen politely rose on his entering the room, but they were apprised by a whisper of disapproval from those standing about that this was a violation of the local etiquette. The crowd in front prostrated themselves on the ground. The chiefs themselves could not withhold that mark of respect. The old man, recovering from a momentary surprise at the boldness of the strangers, called upon his subjects to keep silence, then seated himself near the travellers. In return for the trifling presents which were made to him and his wife, he vouchsafed marks of goodwill in the shape of slight pats on the cheek, the shoulder, or the thigh. But the gratitude of these sovereigns was expressed only by the gift of 7 so-called tarts, probably pieces of cloth, 4 of which were of very fine tissue. Meeting with the chief of Yorlan. Meeting with the chief of Yorlan. After the audience was over, the travellers proceeded to look round the village, where they were astonished to find 2 immense walls made of coral, some blocks of which were of immense size and weight. Notwithstanding a few acts of petty theft committed by the chiefs, the 10 days during which the expedition remained at the island passed without disturbance. The good understanding on which the intercourse between the Frenchmen and the Yulanese was based never suffered a moment's interruption. Duperrey remarks that it is easy to predict that this island of Yulan will one day become of considerable importance. It is situated in the midst of the Caroline group, in the course of ships sailing from New Holland to China, and presents good ports for careening vessels, ample supplies of water, and provisions of various kinds. The inhabitants are generous and peaceably disposed, and they will soon be in a position to supply a kind of food most essential to sailors, from the progeny of the sows that we left with them, a gift which excited a very lively gratitude. Subsequent events, however, have not verified the forecast made by Duperrey. Although a route from Europe to China by the south of Van Diemen's Island passes near the coast of Yorlan, the island is of little more value now than it was 50 years ago. Steam has completely revolutionized the conditions of navigation. Sailors at the commencement of the century could not possibly foresee the radical changes which the introduction of this agent would produce. The Cockwell had not gone more than 2 days' sail from Yorlan, when on the 17th, 18th, and June were discovered several new islands, which by the native inhabitants were called Pelilap, Takai, Ayura, Augai, and Mongol. These are the groups usually called Macaskill and Duperrey, the people resembling those of Yorlan, who, as well as those of the Radek Islands, give to their chiefs the title of Taman. On the 24th of the same month, the Cockwell found herself in the middle of the Hogolu group, which Kotzebue had looked for in too high a latitude, the commander recognizing their bearings by means of certain names given by the natives, which were found entered in the chart of Father Cantova. The hydrographical survey of this group, contained within a circumference of at least 30 leagues, was executed by M. Blois from the 24th to the 27th June. The islands are for the most part high, terminating in volcanic peaks, but some are of opinion, judging from the arrangement of the lagoon, that they are of madreporic formation. They are tenanted by a race of diminutive, badly shaped people, subject moreover to repulsive complaints. If ever the converse of the phrase mens sana in corpore sano can find a just application, it must be here, for these natives are low in the scale of intelligence, and inferior by many degrees to the people of Yorlan. Even at that time foreign styles of dress appeared to have found their way into the islands. Some of the people were wearing conical-shaped hats, after the Chinese fashion. Others had on garments of plaited straw, with a hole in the middle to allow the head to pass through, reminding one of the poncho of the South American. But they held in contempt such trumpery as looking-glasses, necklaces, or bells, asking rather for axes and steel weapons, evidences of frequent intercourse with Europeans. The islands of Tamatan, Fainendick, and Arlap, called the Martyrs on old maps, were next surveyed. Afterwards an ineffectual search was made for the islands of Namarek and Iflauk, about the position assigned to them by Arrowsmith and Malaspina. And then, by way of continuing the exploration of the north side of New Guinea, the Cockwell put in at the port of Dore, on the southeast coast of the island, where a stay was made until the 9th August. Whether estimated by the addition made to natural history, or to geography, or to astronomy, or to science in general, no more profitable a sojourn could have been made than this. The indigenous inhabitants of New Guinea belong to the purest race of Papuans. Their dwellings are huts built upon piles, the entrance to them being made by means of a piece of wood with notches cut in it to serve for steps. This is drawn up into the interior every night. The natives dwelling on the coast are always at war with those in the interior, the Hafis or Arfakis Negroes. Guided by a young Papuan, 500 Ervil succeeded in making his way to the place where these last-mentioned dwelt. He found them gentle, hospitable, courteous creatures, not in the least like the portrait drawn of them by their enemies. After the stay at New Guinea, the Cockwell again sailed through the Moluccas, put in for a short time at Sourabia, upon the coast of Java, and on the 30th October reached the islands of Bourbon and Mauritius. At length, having on the way stopped at St. Helena, where the officers paid a visit to the tomb of Napoleon, and at Ascension, where an English colony had been established since 1815, the corvette entered Marseille on the 24th April, 1825, concluding a voyage that had occupied 31 months and 3 days, over 24,894 nautical miles, without the loss of a single life or any cases of sickness, and without any damage being sustained by the ship. A success in every way so distinguished covered with glory the young commander of the expedition and all its officers, who had manifested such untiring energy in the prosecution of scientific inquiries, yielding a rich harvest of valuable results. 52 charts and plans carefully drawn up, collections of natural specimens of all kinds, both numerous and curious, copious vocabularies, by the help of which it may be possible to throw new light on the migrations of the oceanic peoples, interesting intelligence regarding the productions of the places visited, the condition of commerce and industrial pursuits, observations relating to the shape of the globe, magnetical, meteorological, and botanical researches, such formed the bulk of the valuable freight of knowledge brought home by the Cockquill. The scientific world waited eagerly for the time when this store of information should be thrown open to the public. Chapter 2. Expedition of Baron de Bougainville, stay at Pondicherry, the White Town and the Black Town, right hand and left hand, Malacca, Singapore and its prosperity, stay at Manila, Turon Bay, the monkeys and the people, the marble rocks of Faifo, Cochin Chinese diplomacy, the Anambas, the Sultan of Madura, the Straits of Madura and Alas, Clotes and the Triad, Islands, Tasmania, Botany Bay and New South Wales, Santiago and Valparaiso, return via Cape Horn, expedition of Dumont d'Urville in the Astrolabe, the Peak of Tenerife, Australia, stay at New Zealand, Tongatabu, skirmishes, New Britain and New Guinea, first news of the fate of La Perouse, Vanikoro and its inhabitants, stay at Guam, Amboina and Menado, results of the expedition. The expedition, the command of which was entrusted to Baron de Bougainville, was, strictly speaking, neither a scientific voyage nor a campaign of discovery. Its chief purpose was to unfurl the French flag in the extreme east, and to impress upon the governments of that region the intention of France to protect her nationalities and her interests, everywhere and at all times. The chief instructions given to the commander were that he was to convey to the sovereign of Cochin China a letter from the king, together with some presents, to be placed on board the frigate Thetis. M. de Bougainville was also, whenever possible, without such delays as would prejudice the main object of the expedition, to take hydrographic surveys, and to collect information upon the commerce, productions and means of exchange of the countries visited. 2 vessels were placed under the orders of M. de Bougainville. One, the Thetis, was an entirely new frigate, carrying 44 cannons and 300 sailors, no French frigate of this strength, except the Boudius, having ever before accomplished the voyage round the world. The other, the sloop Esperance, had 20 carronades upon the deck, and carried 120 seamen. The first of these vessels was under the direct orders of Baron de Bougainville, and his staff consisted of picked officers, amongst whom we may mention Longueville, Lapierre and Baudin, afterwards captain, vice-admiral and rear-admiral. The Esperance was commanded by frigate captain de Nerker du Camper, who, as second in command of the frigate Cleopatra, had already explored a great part of the course of the new expedition. It numbered among its officers Turpin, afterwards vice-admiral, deputy and aide-de-camp of Louis-Philippe, Eugene Penaud, afterwards general officer, and Médéric Malevoix, the future governor of Senegal. Not one notable scientific man, such as those who had been billeted in such numbers on the Naturalist and other circumnavigating vessels, had embarked upon those of Baron de Bougainville, to whom it was a constant matter of regret, a regret intensified by the fact that the medical officers, with so many under their care, could not be long absent from the vessels when in port. M. de Bougainville's journal of the voyage opens with this judicious remark. It was not many years ago a dangerous enterprise to make a voyage round the world, and scarce half a century has elapsed since the time when an expedition of this kind would have sufficed to reflect glory upon the man who directed it. This was the good old time, the golden age of the circumnavigator, and the dangers and privations against which he had to struggle were repaid 100-fold, when, rich in valuable discoveries, he hailed on his return the shores of his native land. But this is all over now. The prestige has gone, and we make our tour of the globe nowadays as we should then have made that of France. What would Baron Yves Hyacinthe Potention de Bougainville, the son of the vice-admiral, senator and member of the Institut, say today to our admirable steamships of perfect form, and charts of such minute exactitude that distant voyages appear a mere joke? On the 2nd March 1824, the Thetis quitted the roads at Brest to take up at Bourbon her companion, the Esperance, which, having started some time before, had set sail for Rio de Janeiro, a short stay at Tenerife, where the Thetis was only able to purchase some poor wine and a very small quantity of the provisions needed. A view of the Cape Verde Islands and the Cape of Good Hope in the distance, and a hunt for the fabulous island of Saxemberg, and some rocks no less fictitious, were the only incidents of the voyage to Bourbon, where the Esperance had already arrived. Bourbon was at this time so familiar a point with the navigators that there was little to be said about it, when its two open roads of St. Denis and St. Paul had been mentioned. St. Denis, the capital, situated on the north of Bourbon, and at the extremity of a sloping tableland, was, properly speaking, merely a large town without enclosure or walls, and each house in it was surrounded by a garden. There were no public buildings or places of interest worth mentioning except the governor's palace, situated in such a position as to command a view of the whole road. The Botanic Garden and the Jardin de Naturalisation, which dates from the former, which is in the centre of the town, contains some beautiful walks, unfortunately but little frequented, and it is admirably kept. The eucalyptus, the giant of the Australian forests, the Phormium tenax, the New Zealand hemp plant, the casuarina, the pine of Madagascar, the baobab with its trunk of prodigious size, the carambolas, the sapota, the vanilla, combined to beautify this garden, which was refreshed by streams of sparkling water. The second, upon the brow of a hill, formed of terraces rising one above the other, to which several brooklets give life and fertility, was specially devoted to the acclimatization of European trees and plants. The apple, peach, apricot, cherry, and pear trees, which have thriven well, have already supplied the colony with valuable shoots. The vine was also grown in this garden, together with the tea plant and several rarer species, amongst which Bougainville noted with delight the Laurea argentea, with its bright leaves. On the 9th June the two vessels left the roads of St. Denis, after having doubled the shoals of La Fortune and Saya de Malha, and passed off the Seychelles, whilst among the atolls to the south of the Maldive Islands, which are level with the surface of the water and covered with bushy trees ending in a cluster of cocoas, they sighted the island of Ceylon and the Coromandel coast, and cast anchor before Pondicherry. Natives of Pondicherry. Natives of Pondicherry. Ancient idols near Pondicherry. Ancient idols near Pondicherry. Facsimile of early engraving. This part of India is far from answering to the enchantress idea, which the dithyrambic descriptions of writers who have celebrated its marvels have led Europeans to form. The number of public buildings and monuments at Pondicherry will scarcely bear counting, and when one has visited the more curious of the pagodas, and the boilers, whose only recommendation is their utility, there is nothing very interesting, except the novelty of the scenes met with at every turn. The town is divided into two well-defined quarters, the one called the White Town, dull and deserted in spite of its coquettish-looking buildings, and the far more interesting Black Town, with its bazaars, its jugglers, its massive pagodas, and the attractive dances of the bayadirs. The Indian population upon the coast of Coromandel, says the narrative, is divided into two classes, the right hand and the left. This division originated under the government of a nabob against whom the people revolted, those who remained faithful to the prince being distinguished by the designation of right hand, and the rest by that of left hand. These two great tribes, which divide between them almost equally the entire population, are in a chronic state of hostility against the holders of the ranks and prerogatives obtained by the friends of the prince. The latter, however, retain the offices in the gift of the government, whilst the others are engaged in commerce. To maintain peace amongst them, it was necessary to allow them to retain their ancient processions and ceremonies. The right hand and left hand are subdivided into 18 castes or guilds, full of pretensions and prejudices, not diminished even by the constant intercourse with Europeans which has now for centuries been maintained. Hence have arisen feelings of rivalry and contempt, which would be the source of sanguinary wars, were it not that the Hindus have a horror of bloodshed, and that their temperament renders them averse to conflict. These two facts, i.e., the gentleness of the native disposition and the constant presence of an element of discord amongst the various tribes, must ever be borne in mind if we would understand the political phenomenon of more than 50 millions of men submitting to the yoke of some 25,000 or 30,000 foreigners. The Thetis and the Esperance quitted the roadstead of Pondicherry on the 30th July, crossed the Sea of Bengal, sighted the islands of Nicobar and Pulo Penang, with its free port capable of holding 300 ships at a time. They then entered the Straits of Malacca, and remained in the Dutch port of that name from the 24th to the 26th July, to repair damages sustained by the Esperance, so that she might hold out as far as Manila. The intercourse of the explorers with the resident and the inhabitants generally were all the more pleasant that it was confirmed by banquets given on land, and on board the Thetis in honour of the kings of France and the Netherlands. The Dutch were expecting soon to cede this station to the English, and this cession took place shortly afterwards. It must be added with regard to Malacca that in point of fertility of soil, pleasantness of situation and facilities for obtaining all really necessary supplies, it was superior to its rivals. Bougainville set out again on August 26th, and was tossed about by head winds, and troubled alike by calms and storms during the remainder of his passage through the straits. As these latitudes were more frequented than any others by Malay pirates, the commandant placed sentries on the watch and took all precautions against surprise, although his force was strong enough to be above fearing any enemy. It was no uncommon thing to see flyboats manned by 100 seamen, and more than one merchant ship had recently fallen a prey to these unmolested and incorrigible corsairs. The squadron, however, saw nothing to awake any suspicions, and continued its course to Singapore. The population of this town is a curious mixture of races, and our travellers met with Europeans engaged in the chief branches of commerce, Armenian and Arabian merchants and Chinese, some planters, others following the various trades demanded by the requirements of the population. The Malays, who seemed out of place in an advancing civilization, either led a life of servitude, or slept away their time in indolence and misery, whilst the Hindus, expelled from their country for crime, practiced the indescribable trades which in all great cities alone saved the scum from dying of starvation. It was only in 1819 that the English procured from the Malayan Sultan of Johor the right to settle in the town of Singapore, and the little village in which they established themselves then numbered but 150 inhabitants, although, thanks to Sir Stamford Raffles, a town soon rose on the site of the unpretending cabins of the natives. By a wise stroke of policy, all customs duties were abolished, and the natural advantages of the new city, with its extensive and secure port, were supplemented and perfected by the hand of man. The garrison numbered only 300 sepoys and 30 gunners. There were as yet no fortifications, and the artillery equipment consisted merely of one battery of 20 cannons, and as many bronze field pieces. Indeed, Singapore was simply one large warehouse, to which Madras sent cotton cloth, Calcutta opium, Sumatra pepper, Java eric and spices, Manila sugar and eric, all forthwith dispatched to Europe, China, Siam, and sea of public buildings there appeared to be none. There were no stores, no careening wharves, no building yards, no barracks, and the visitors noticed but one small church for native converts. The squadron resumed its voyage on the 2nd September, and reached the harbour of Cavite without any mishap. Meanwhile, M. du Camper, commander of the Esperance, who had, during a residence of some years, become acquainted with the principal inhabitants, was ordered to go to Manila, that he might inform the Governor-General of the Philippines of the arrival of the frigates, the reasons of their visit, and see, and at the same time gauge his feelings towards them, and form some idea of the reception the French might expect. The recent intervention of France in the affairs of Spain placed them indeed in a very delicate position with the then governor, Don Juan Antonio Martinez, who had been nominated to his post by the very Cortes which had just been overthrown by their government. The fears of the commandant, however, were not confirmed, for he met with the warmest kindness and most cordial cooperation from the Spanish authorities. Cavite Bay, where the vessels cast anchor, was constantly encumbered with mud, but it was the chief port in the Philippine Islands, and there the Spaniards owned a very well-supplied arsenal in which worked Indians from the surrounding districts, who though skillful and intelligent were excessively lazy. Whilst the Thetis was being sheathed, and the extensive repairs necessary to the Esperance were being carried out, the clerks and officers were at Manila, seeing about the supply of provisions and cordage, the latter which was made of abaca, the fibre of a banana, vulgarly called Manila hemp, although recommended on account of its great elasticity, was not of much use on board ship. The delay at Manila was rendered very disagreeable by earthquakes and typhoons, which are always of constant occurrence there. On October 24th, there was an earthquake of such violence that the governor, troops, and a portion of the people were compelled hastily to leave the town, and the loss was estimated at 120,000 L. Many houses were thrown down, 8 people were buried in the ruins, and many others injured. Scarcely had the inhabitants begun to breathe freely again, when a frightful typhoon came to complete the panic. It lasted only part of the night of the 31st October, and the next day, when the sun rose, it might have been looked upon as a mere nightmare had not the melancholy sight of fields laid waste, and of the harbour with 6 ships lying on their sides, and all the others at anchor, almost entirely disabled, testified to the reality of the disaster. All around the town the country was devastated, the crops were ruined, the trees, even the largest of them, violently shaken, the village destroyed. It was a heartrending spectacle. The Esperance had its main mast and mizzen mast lifted several feet above deck, and its barricadings were carried off. The Thetis, more fortunate than its companion, escaped almost uninjured in the dreadful tempest. The laziness of the workpeople, and the great number of holidays in which they indulge, early decided Bougainville to part for a time from his convoy, and on December 12 he set sail for Cochin China. Before following the French to the little frequented shores of that country, however, we must survey with them Manila and its environs. The Bay of Manila is one of the most extensive and beautiful in the world. Numerous fleets might find anchorage in it, and its 2 channels were not yet closed to foreign vessels, and in 1798 2 English frigates had been allowed to pass through them and carry off numerous vessels under the very guns of the town. The horizon is shut in by a barrier of mountains, ending on the south of the Tal, a volcano now almost extinct, but the eruptions of which have often caused frightful calamities. In the plains, framed in rice plantations, several hamlets and solitary houses give animation to the scene. Opposite to the mouth of the bay rises the town, containing 60,000 inhabitants, with its lighthouse and far-extending suburbs. It is watered by the Pasig, a river issuing from Bay Lake, and its exceptionally good situation secures to it advantages which more than one capital might envy. The garrison, without including the militia, consisted at that time of 2,200 soldiers, and in addition to the military navy, always represented by some vessel at anchor, a marine service had been organized for the exclusive use of the colony, to which the name of Sutil had been given, either on account of the small size or the fleetness of the vessels employed. This service, all appointments in which are in the gift of the Governor-General, is composed of schooners and gunsloops, intended to protect the coasts and the trading vessels against the pirates of Sulu. But it cannot be said that the organization, imposing as it is, has achieved any great results. Of this Bougainville gives the following curious illustration. In 1828, the Suluans seized of the inhabitants upon the coast of Luzon, and an expedition sent against them cost 140,000 piastres and resulted in the killing of 6 men. Near the Bay of Manila. Near the Bay of Manila. Facsimile of early engraving. Great uneasiness prevailed in the Philippines at the time of the visit of the Thetis and the Esperance, and a political reaction which had steeped the metropolis in blood had thrown a gloom over every one. On December 20, 1820, a massacre of the whites by the Indians. In 1824, the mutiny of a regiment and the assassination of an ex-governor, Senor de Falgueras, had been the first horrors which had endangered the supremacy of the Spanish.